Open your Bibles with me to the book of Romans chapter 1. Last week we began a new series in this book of Romans. We reminded ourselves that it is all about Jesus. It's all about Jesus. So with that in mind, let's begin reading Romans 1. We're going to begin in verse number 8, and I invite you to stand with me as we honor God and His Word, reading it together. The Word should be there for you on the screen. Romans 1, beginning of verse number 8. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being proclaimed throughout the whole world. For God, whom I serve in my spirit, in the preaching of the gospel of His Son, is my witness as to how unceasingly I make mention of you, always in my prayers, making request, if perhaps at last, by the will of God, I may succeed in coming to you. For I long to see you, so that I may impart some spiritual gift to you, that you may be established. That is, that I may be encouraged together with you, while among you, each of us by the other's faith, both yours and mine. I don't want you to be unaware, brethren, that often I have planned to come to you, and have been prevented so far, so that I may obtain some fruit among you, even as among the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation, both to the Greeks and barbarians, both to wise and to the foolish. So for my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. For it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous man shall live by faith. Let's pray. Father God, we ask today that you would speak to us, that you'd help us to understand the words that we've read, or you help us to apply them to our lives. My prayer, Lord, today for us is that we would be those who would walk by faith today. Pray you'd speak to us now, and we ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. Y'all may be seated. If you hadn't noticed, Paul is excited. As you're reading Romans 1, 8 through 17, he says over and over and over again how fired up he is. He can't wait to go and preach the gospel to those who are in Rome. He hasn't been able to travel there yet. He's been thwarted in his desire. But man, he can't wait. He's heard about their faith. He doesn't know them personally. He hasn't begun the church there. He didn't start the church. He didn't launch that church. He didn't plant that church. But he's heard about what God is doing. And isn't it interesting, when Jesus is working somewhere, word gets out. You start to hear about it. That was the thing in the Gospels. Whenever Jesus was in a place, they were like, hey, he was like, hey, keep it quiet. And it was like, no, you couldn't keep it quiet. Everybody said, hey, Jesus is here and he's working. Well, that's the same way in a church. It's interesting. It's also the same way when the other guy's working. Word gets out. And so whether it's God moving or whether it's Satan moving, there's something happening in a group of believers. The word gets out. So Paul's hearing, he says, God's doing some great things and I want to go and I can't wait to get there and share the gospel with you. Now, that's an interesting thing considering all that the gospel and preaching the gospel has brought to Paul. He left behind quite a bit in his journey and following Jesus. Acts chapter 9 records how Paul's salvation happens. I mean, he is on the way. We said last week he went from jihad to Jesus. He's on his way to kill Christians, and then he meets Jesus on that road to Damascus, and the Lord prepares him, and then he is sending out. And immediately you see in the book of Acts, as Paul goes out to preach the gospel, almost as soon as he starts his ministry, persecution happens. And so he goes from being this honored Pharisee of Pharisees, this man who is honored and revered in the community, to someone who is being persecuted, mocked, and attacked physically for his faith on several occasions. Paul's preaching of the gospel causes him to be beaten within an inch of his life. He's thrown in jail for preaching the gospel. He had to be smuggled out of Thessalonica in the cover of darkness for preaching the gospel. He was run out of Berea. He was laughed out of Athens. And he says, I can't wait to go preach the gospel to you in Rome. We can only assume he was going to face some of the same things. So what was wrong with Paul? Was he crazy? Was he just out of his mind? Did he just like suffering? Why was he so excited? Why was he so charged up to go and preach the gospel? Well, I want you to answer that question, we have to look at some of the statements that he makes. And so look at down in verse 14, verse 15, and verse 16. You have three statements that are I am statements that Paul's making. So you might highlight these, you might underline them, you might just note them. But it's going to help us understand, why is he so excited? Why is he so charged up? Why is he so passionate about preaching the gospel? The first thing he says in verse 14 is, I'm under obligation. Some translations say, I am a debtor. There are two ways you can go into debt. One way of going into debt is the way most of us do. You buy something that you don't have the funds to purchase. So you borrow the money from somebody else. You're allowed to acquire the thing, whether it's a home or a car or whatever it is, and you then have to pay off the balance that you owe. That's the first kind of debt. Some of you are horrified that I would even mention that. You were hoping not to think about that today, and now you're burdened by that, right? That's the first kind of debt. But there's another kind of debt, and this is the kind that Romans 1 is talking about. It's when someone entrusts something to you, it doesn't belong to you. You haven't borrowed the money. The thing belongs to someone else. They're entrusting it to you for the purpose that you would carry out their will for that particular item. So it may be something that you are supposed to transport or to take and care and bring somewhere else. And that's what he's talking about here. So Paul is saying this about the gospel. When the gospel came to him, it wasn't just for him. The gospel came to him on the way to others. It's the same way for us. When we get the gospel, it's not just for you. It's not just for me. It's not just for us to say, man, I'm so glad I'm saved. Aren't you glad you're a part of the family of God? So we just kind of huddle up and say, man, I'm so glad I'm saved. We ought to be. But it's for someone else also. So he says, I am obligated. I have a debt. By the fact that I know about this great news, I can't keep it to myself. I've got to share this with someone else. That's the eagerness. That's where he gets his passion. He says, I have this obligation. It's a calling from God, and that's every believer. We have this. So I'm under obligation. And he says, notice the end of verse 14, both to Greeks, to barbarians, to the wise, and the foolish. Those categories don't make any sense to us, but the Roman culture was highly stratified. Classes really mattered, and the Greeks were the cultured ones. That's the high class. The barbarians were the lower class. You have the wise and the foolish there, the educated, the uneducated. And Paul says, I'm under obligation not to one group of people, but to all, to everyone. There is no, God is not a respecter of persons. He's not worried like we are. What class does somebody belong to? What division can we make among groups of people? No, that's not how we think about in terms of the gospel. It's for everyone. And so Paul says, it doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter what background you're in. He says, I am under obligation to get the gospel. I want you to know what I have experienced in the gospel of Jesus. Look at the second I am statement in verse 15. So for my part, he says, I'm eager. It means he's ready to serve. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. Some of you who are teachers, elementary school teachers, you've experienced this. Or if you've ever been around, maybe you teach Sunday school with younger kids. Maybe you've coached younger kids or whatever. If you ask a group of young children, you say, hey, I need a volunteer. You know what happens in that group? Every hand goes up. Like you haven't even finished your sentence yet of what you're asking them to do. You're like, I need to volunteer too. And they're like, ooh, pick me. Now, somewhere along the line, that reverses. I don't know where that is, but when you get a group of adults together and you're like, I need someone to, and everyone's like, don't pick me, right? But what's the difference? Maturity, brother. We mature. No, eagerness is the difference. I take the enthusiasm of that group of young children any day. They're eager, they're ready, they're saying, hey, I want to go. And so that is the expression here that he's using. I am eager to preach the gospel. Now, why is he eager? Well, I think this is because he understands some things about what the gospel accomplishes when you share it. Look at verse 11. Look at verse 11. Why is Paul so eager to share the gospel? He's writing, by the way, to those in Rome. They're part of the church. They're already believers. In our minds today, we classify everything so neatly. We're like, well, those believers, they don't need to hear the gospel. They've already heard it. That's why they're believers. They don't need to hear it again. But notice what he says about it. I'm eager to come and preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. Why? Well, look at verse 11. So that you may be established. Means strengthened. So Paul is so eager to share the gospel because he knows that in the preaching of the gospel, that's how he can build up and strengthen those whose faith can get weakened. I don't know if you've realized this or not. Maybe this shouldn't be a newsflash for anyone, but living in the world, man, you've got all these forces constantly coming at you. It's that way in the first century. It's that way every century, every age of believers. You are faced daily with this barrage of arrows from an enemy called Satan that's incoming towards you, that is causing you to be weakened in your faith. And so you need to continually be established. So we need to know the gospel and continue to shore up that foundation. So preaching the gospel does that. We remind ourselves of what is the foundation. What are our lives? What are we building our faith on, truly? And so he says, so that you may be established. By the way, he includes himself. Look at verse 12. In the preaching of the gospel, Paul's saying, hey, you know what's going to happen? I can't wait to go and share this with you because as I encourage you, you're going to encourage me. We're going to be encouraged together. That's the beauty of the church. There is no Christian anywhere that can say, man, I don't need a body of believers in my life. That is a fallacy. It's wrong. That is of Satan to say, you know, I'm a Christian, but I don't need a body of Christ. Well, I don't need to be part of that. I'm strong. Well, the Apostle Paul sure didn't think that. He couldn't wait to be together with a group of believers. If he needs to be strengthened, surely you and I do. So he's eager because of the strength. And then he talks about verse 13. He says, I'm eager to preach. Why? So that I may obtain some fruit among you. There is fruit that comes when you preach the gospel. Not only are people strengthened, but people are changed. The gospel produces 3 different kinds of fruit in our lives. The first is a transformation of attitudes. The Bible talks about the fruit of the Spirit. What makes a person loving, joyful, filled with peace, filled with kindness, all of those things, Galatians 5 talks about. It's the preaching of the gospel that does that. Not only are there fruit, is there fruit in our attitudes, there is fruit in our actions. Through the preaching of the gospel, that is literally where lives are changed. People are changed in the way they live through the message of Jesus. And the third fruit of preaching the gospel is there will be people who convert to Christ, who come to Jesus. And so Paul is saying, I can't wait for that experience. Look at verse 16. The third I am statement. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. So he says, I'm charged up. I can't wait to come and preach. And he says, if we didn't already get it, he's like, I'm not ashamed of this message. Now, why would he say that? Why would he make that statement? It's because understanding what the gospel is, it is a message that uniquely does not exalt man. Think about it. The message of Jesus is that the good news of the gospel is that Jesus came to this earth because you and I are sinful. We have no hope of making ourselves right with God, but Jesus came in our place. He lived an obedient life to God, a perfect, sinless life. He died a sacrificial death on the cross. They buried him. He rose on the third day. He's alive today, and that is our hope for salvation. That does nothing to exalt man. It doesn't lift you up. It doesn't lift me up. So when Paul is coming to preach the gospel in Rome, if they understood what he was saying, if they listened to his message, there would be nobody that would come away from hearing Paul where they would say, man, Paul is so great. No, if they heard the message, what they would say is, Jesus is so great. Because in preaching Jesus, he alone is exalted and we're humbled. In fact, Jesus told us that. He said, if you're going to follow me, he said, you got to take up your cross. So following Jesus, preaching Jesus, sharing Jesus is not something that exalts you and I. It exalts Jesus alone. And think of all the things that Paul went through. So in spite of all that, he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. He has this incredible confidence in the gospel. And that's what I want to do today is encourage you, because we live in a world today where when you compare our attitude toward the gospel with Paul's attitude, I don't know that we could say with him, I'm not ashamed. I think if we were honest before God today, I think there are many times where we would have to say, I am ashamed of the gospel. And so what I want to do today is encourage you, to build you up, to strengthen you to where by the end of this message you would understand the words of Romans 1. You would say, man, I am not ashamed. What does it take to live that kind of life, that unashamed life? And I want us just to think for a minute about being a Christian in the world that we live in today. If I haven't made you mad yet, this will make you mad. But the message of Jesus does seem foolish to the world around us, right? But we have nothing to be ashamed of because it's a message that's true. It's a message, there's an empty tomb. Jesus is alive. The power of the gospel we're going to see. But you think about some of the messages that the world around us preaches. And the thing that strikes me today is the world around us is very confident. They're not ashamed of the messages that they preach. Have you ever considered that? There are gospels. I mean, the belief systems of our culture today, people are almost evangelists for them. Have you thought about this? Like, take for instance the LGBTQ movement. Here's the gospel of the LGBTQ movement. It's that this phrase is a catchword. It's that love is love. Which if there was ever something that was meaningless, that is meaningless. Like that doesn't mean anything. You can't define a word with the word. That's not a statement. That's just like you're just whatever. That just makes you feel good. But what that means to that group of people is that you were born with certain desires and attractions and you can't change them. That's how you were born. So you should be able to marry whoever you want to marry, love whoever you want to love, call whatever you want to call a family. You don't need a mom and a dad. You could have two moms, two dads, whatever. It doesn't matter. That's all the same because that's how you were born. But the same group that preaches that also says that some people were born with the wrong bodies. And if you're born with the wrong body, then if you decide that, you can change what you are. So if you're a girl and you really think you're a boy, then you are a boy. And if you're a boy and you really think you're a girl, then you really are those things. That is absolute madness. It is so foolish. But Listen, the people that share that and put that out, they're not ashamed. They're not ashamed. And it makes no sense. It makes no sense. So understand, Christian, like, I just want you to know, you and I have so much of a better story than that. Why are we ashamed? So let's build up our confidence today. So let me unpack two things, and you guys got to listen fast because you haven't listened fast enough, okay? We got a lot to get through today. And so what I want to do is two truths that will build you up in this conference. So the first one's verse 16. He says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And then he gives the first reason. He says, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. And so what I want to do is unpack this phrase a little bit, section by section. So he says the gospel is the power of God. The message that we just talked about of what Jesus has done for us. He says that is the power of God. So don't misunderstand what he's saying here. He's not saying simply that the gospel is powerful. He is saying that, but he's saying more than that. He says the gospel is the power of God. So, whatever power God has, the gospel has. So we say this, we say God is omnipotent. So therefore, the gospel is an expression of God's omnipotence. That is a crazy thought. So what God has given to us in the gospel, the reason we don't have to be ashamed of the message is because God has so determined that in the message of Jesus, He would express all of His power in saving people. And that's pretty awesome to think about. The gospel is the power of God for salvation. So it's not just that it's powerful, it's that it exhibits His power. So I want you to compare that with what you and I have the ability to do. Right now, Lauren and I, we have this puppy that we always are talking about. And we're training him. He's not very obedient, not very good. He's a sweet dog. If any of you want him, just let us know. We will bless you with him. No, if that happened, Andrew would be really sad. So we can't do that. But we're training him, right? And so there's some things that he's really, really good. We've trained him really well. I took him running yesterday, and he was running with me, and he can be running along. Somebody can come out in their front yard, and I've got him where he doesn't like try to go and attack the person. He just kind of sticks with me, runs right along. Like, I've trained him to do some stuff. But there's some things I just can't train him to do. For instance, the other day, I think it was Friday, he was in the backyard, and I'm like, oh, great. He's digging a hole. So I yell at him, hey, stop that. Come here. Guess who didn't come? The well-trained dog. He didn't come. And then come to find out, we go over there, and he is digging, and he was actually hunting. And so apparently we had this den of crickets in our backyard, so he's eating crickets. So I can train my dog to do certain things. I can train him to walk, I can train him to sit, I can train him to do certain things, but his nature is still that he's a dog. And if some of you are like, I can train your dog not to eat crickets. Okay, help me out with that one. But I'm telling you what, there's some things that even though I can train him, I can't change his nature. And here's what's going on. The reason the gospel is the power of God is so important for us to understand is that many people get it wrong. We think that the message of Jesus is all about just modifying our behavior so that we would obey, that we would behave, that the purpose of what's in the Bible is just so that we would be better people. That's not it. If you think that's the message of the gospel, you miss what the message of the Bible is. You can't be good. In fact, in Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, he asks this question. He talks about the likelihood of us changing our own hearts is like a leopard changing its spots. It's not going to happen. You and I can't change us. But guess what? The gospel is the power of God. That's why there is just a futility in us trying to make ourselves better people. Just I want to behave better. I want to live better. Oh, sure, you can do some things. You can lose weight. You can act better. You can make better choices in your life. You can get out of debt. You can do some things that you could say, man, I like my life better. But it still doesn't change the fact that your problem is sin. And you are and I am a sinner. And we cannot deliver ourselves from that predicament. But the gospel is the power of God, he says, for salvation. What does that word salvation mean? And this is the second thing I want you to see here on this. The gospel is the power of God for salvation. You know what salvation means? It means deliverance. It means rescue. I was reading this week was the anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. That got me thinking about this word rescue and deliverance. If you were on the Titanic, as the Titanic was going down, and there wasn't enough room in the lifeboats, which that's the story, that's what makes it so tragic, right? You would find yourself floating in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. What do you need at that point? This is where I need my 8-year-olds. I know. There's a lot of things you need. If you're floating in the middle of the Atlantic in April, you'd be like, I need to get warm. You might say, I need to get a drink of water. You're surrounded by water, but there's none of it you can drink. You might say, I need some food because I'm tired of treading water because it's been hours since the boat has gone down and I'm losing energy. You might need any of those things. But what you need most, what you need above all, is rescue. You need to be delivered. That's what God offers in the gospel. Rescue, deliverance, not just reforming a corner of your life, not just helping you feel better about your life, but truly changing you, rescuing you out of the circumstances which you're in. We've lost the urgency of that because in the modern church, we've thought that in order to help people come to Jesus, we had to downplay sin. So we don't talk about the seriousness of sin anymore because that might offend someone. We don't talk about a place called hell because, my goodness, that might offend someone. And if it was something somebody had made up, yeah, that would be offensive. But guess what? It's a real place. Jesus himself warned us about it. So if we don't tell people, we're lying. In the book of Jude, it tells us that we are to preach the gospel so that people would be saved. Like he talks about plucking others from the fire. That's what rescue and salvation is all about. It's about being delivered from eternity in hell. Like that's the greatest need that people have, and that's what God offers in the gospel. But in our day, we've kind of come to the place where we think, well, that's not really what it's important to us here. There's a book called The Courage to be Protestant, and author David Wells writes this. He says, what has happened, of course, is that over a period of time, our society has slowly exited the moral world and now lives instead in a psychological world. The difference is that in one, there's right and wrong. The other, there's not. In this other world, we are comfortable or not, psychologically healthy or not, dysfunctional or not, but we are never sinners. That's the world that we live in today, and even in the church. So understanding what God offers in the gospel is rescue from man's greatest problem called sin and the consequences of sin. That's good news. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for salvation. Then he says, to everyone who believes. Everyone who believes. In fact, look at how he ends the verse. To the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Whatever way you want to separate people, and that Jewish, that would have been the religious, Greek would have been the pagans. However you want to divide people and separate people out, the gospel is for everyone who believes. And he says for the Jew first. In other words, Jesus came, he was the promised Messiah. He came through God's people. They were part of God's plan. And anyone can come to Jesus who believes. That's what he's saying. He's saying the gospel is the power of God's salvation for everyone who believes. Now, he's not talking about belief in terms of, oh yeah, I believe it. No, the gospel kind of belief that he's talking about is a belief of the heart. It's a reliance in your life. Romans 10, that if you confess, Romans 10:9, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. So this is a belief, not just like, oh yeah, I believe in what Jesus did. Oh yeah, I believe in God. That's not what kind of belief he's talking about. He's talking about the belief that relies on Jesus and what he did alone. He says, if we would have that kind of faith, we can be delivered. That's the gospel. Yesterday, I was down here at the church in the afternoon, and it was right as that rain came through. And so I happened to be actually in this building, and I could hear the rain on the top of the roof, right? So I could hear it, and I was like, okay, cool, it's raining, that's good, you know. And then I heard like something more than rain. Did y'all hear this? There was some hail that started. And that concerned me. And I had my car parked in the awning out there. But I was like, I'm not sure it's under there far enough. Anyways. And so I ran out there and I moved my car. Sure enough, some of it was uncovered by the awning and the hail was coming in. So I backed it up. And as I did that, what I noticed was all these cars started streaming into our awning out here. And there are 3 lanes out there. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but you can fit approximately 10 vehicles under there, just in case you ever want to know. So I'm standing out there, and people just, as the hail came in, they were just cruising right in there. Everybody was cramming in, trying to get as many cars under there. And what happened as they were taking cover was really educational. They didn't do all the things that people do in relationship to religion and things like that. They didn't tell themselves, they didn't worry as they were coming over to the awning. They weren't like, oh, I can't come over there because I'm not dressed right. I can't come over there because I've been in a lot of storms before, and so I can't take shelter under that awning because I've been through a lot of storms already, and I don't know if it would do me any good. No, what happened was everybody just headed for cover. And that's what the gospel is. It is a covering against the storm that is God's judgment that will come on anyone who doesn't believe and doesn't know the gospel and doesn't have the power of God of salvation in their lives. And church, that is our confidence. We take refuge in that, and that's a good message. It's a good illustration of how when people really realize their need, they're just coming and they're just taking shelter. That's what the gospel is. But notice there's a second thing he gets into in verse 17. For in the gospel, not only is the gospel the power of God, but the second reason we can be confident in the gospel is that the gospel reveals the righteousness of God. This word of revealing it describes uncovering something. You're unveiling it. The other day, Andrew went to a friend of his. They had a birthday party, and he brought a gift in a bag, and there was a lot of activity going on. He said, I don't think my friend opened his gift. It remained under wraps, right? It had to be revealed. He didn't get to see it, and Andrew was kind of disappointed because he wanted his friend to see the gift. Well, that's what this word revealed is all about. It's that God has given us something in the gospel that it could only be revealed. It's not something you and I could think of and come up with. The gospel is not something that you and I could manufacture or make up. It's something that God himself revealed. And he says in it, the righteousness of God. Now that's a description of several things. First, the righteousness of God is an attribute of who God is. God is righteous. He's just. Genesis 18:25 says, will not the Lord of all the earth do right? That's our God. That's what he does. Whatever he does is good and right and just and true. That's his character. So in the gospel, God's character itself is revealed. So chapter 3 will tell us God is both in the gospel. He's just because he punishes sin. He's not like some of the judges that you hear about today in society that somebody kills somebody, they just let them go or whatever. He's not unjust. He makes sure the crime is, there's accountability there. Understand that. There is his judgment that's there. He's just. But he's also the justifier of those who have faith in Jesus. So he provides a way of salvation. So his righteousness is revealed. So it's part of his character. It's an attribute of God. But it's also an action of God. The righteousness of God is revealed. Remember, that's what we said. It's revealed. You and I couldn't come up with it on our own. We couldn't figure it out. It's not like somebody sat down one day and was like, I'm going to figure this out. And this is how salvation happened. Some guy somewhere just figured it out one day. No, God himself came to us in the person of Jesus and revealed to us. The prophet Isaiah talked about how God would bring his righteousness near. That's what happened when Jesus showed up. He's God in human flesh. So the very character of God shows up in this world, and he brought salvation near. And then you put those two things together. It's God's attribute, it's God's action, but then it's also an achievement. It's also an accomplishment that you and I get to reap the benefits of. The righteousness of God is a status where God declares that is who we are in Jesus. Now that is something incredible. I want to show you what I mean by that. So turn over, you're here in Romans, turn over a couple pages, go over to 2 Corinthians 5. Let me show you this. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says this, he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So, Jesus, what God did is Jesus became what he was not, which is sin, so that you and I could become what we're not, which is righteous. And that's what happens. The gospel reveals that is what God is doing in the life of a man or a woman who trusts Jesus. And then he says this, it is revealed from faith to faith. What does that mean? It means this, from beginning to end, that process of someone entering into that relationship, entering into that status of being right with God, it has always been by faith, and it will always be by faith. And he quotes here, at the end of the verse, the prophet Habakkuk, who says, the righteous man shall live by faith. It's quoted a couple other places in the New Testament, but even in the Old Testament, that's how you were saved. It was by faith. You're never saved by works. It's never by what you do. Then you would be able to boast. You'd be able to exalt yourself and say, hey, look what a great person I am. Look what I've done. No. The gospel is about the righteousness of God. It's about what Jesus has done, and it's revealed. And so understanding this builds our confidence. I was reading the other day a story that I had no idea about that happened in American history. This is something that in the year 1901, the president was a man named William McKinley. And he was very, very popular. In fact, he was so popular that in that day they didn't have a lot of security for the presidents. And he was going to this exposition, it was like a World's Fair. It was in Buffalo, New York. And people from all over the world were going to come to this to see the latest and greatest technologies. They were introducing all kinds of new gadgets and gizmos. In fact, they expected, and attendance records for the period of this exposition was over 8 million people came to the event to see all these things. And so he wanted to be there in the middle of that because he wanted to meet people, and that's just. And so his security team told him, "Hey, we don't think this is a good idea." And he was so popular among the people. So I don't know if this was before they really relied on all the polling, but he felt like he was really, really the man. And so he told him, he said, "I can't imagine anyone would want to harm me." So he had one day at the fair, he had a line of receiving where he just met people and shook hands. And so people were going through the line, and he was talking to people. And one man through the line, sure enough, did want to harm him. Pulled out a gun and shot him. And he went down, a bullet went into his abdomen. Well, they rushed him to the hospital that was there, set up in that grounds. They didn't have all the best equipment for the surgery, but they had to remove this bullet. They had to save his life, And so they were trying to figure out what to do, and it was really complicated because it turns out he was a very large man. And so they were like, man, and so they started to try and find this bullet that had gone into his abdomen, but the poor man was so fat, they couldn't find it. And so they were like, what do we do? And they were trying to come up with things, and somebody told them, they said, hey, there's this new technology invented by Thomas Edison, and we think it could help you find the bullet. And it's called an X-ray. And they were like, no, that might make him uncomfortable. We're not sure if it's even going to work. And so they decided not to use the X-ray. Well, turns out a few days later, the president died. They had a tool at their disposal that could have solved the problem, could have saved a life, and they weren't sure that it was going to work, so they didn't rely on it. I thought about that as I was thinking about what the Bible is telling us here about the power of the gospel. We don't have something in the gospel that's experimental. It's not something that's never been tried before. It's not something new. It's something that God has been doing all throughout history. Literally today, you and I can say for thousands of years, by faith in what God himself has done, he has been saving people. I'm excited about that. Some of y'all are like, let's just go to lunch. Can we just go to lunch? Can you not be done yet, Pastor? I'm just telling you, we can have confidence in this message. We can have confidence to share it. It's the power of God. There is something that God does where you might think you might write somebody off and say, there's no way. That person is too far from God. You have no idea what God can do. The gospel is the power of God to salvation. But we've got to share it. We've got to speak it. We've got to pray. We've got to believe that this message really is important, that people hear it. We can't tell ourselves the silly lies that we tell ourselves, like, well, I can't share the gospel because I'm not sure this person even would respond. It's the power of God. It's not up to you. Sometimes we tell ourselves the lie, well, I don't know if I can share the gospel because they're not my best friend yet. That's silly. How long do you have to know someone before you share that? I'm so thankful that people I didn't know, pastors I didn't have a personal relationship with, would stand up and share the gospel. If you could only rely on the people that you knew deeply to share the gospel, you might never hear it. So let's I wish we could strip away some of the things that we rely on and just say, you know what? It's the power of God. Let's rely on it. Let's believe in it. Let's see what God can do. I want our worship team to come right now. I'm going to try and quit. I want our worship team to come. And I just want us to do business with God. Today, maybe your prayer is, Lord, forgive me because I've been ashamed of the gospel. Forgive me because I haven't shared it. I've just forgotten. what God can do. And maybe your prayer is just, Lord, I just want to believe. I just want to instill that confidence in the gospel. Maybe today, as we're talking about this, as we're preaching about this, maybe your prayer just needs to be for that person in your life. You've been praying for your one. We've been talking about who's your one this year. Maybe today that's where you are, is you're just like, man, yes, thank you for the encouragement. I just need to be praying for my one. Would you do that today during our invitation? Would you make that your prayer? God, I know you are working in this person's life. Lord, I want them to come to Jesus. I want them to believe. I want them to hear the gospel. And you're just calling out their name. But for some of you today, what you need to do is not any one of those things. For some of you, what you need to do is you yourself need to believe. It's from faith to faith. You've heard what Jesus has done. Now it's time to believe and put your faith in Christ. And in just a minute, we're all going to stand and sing. And when we do that, our pastors are going to be at the front of every aisle. And if God is speaking to you about coming to Christ, you know that's what you need to do. We're going to be here, and we would love to lead you to the Lord and show you how you can know Jesus in a personal way. So let's stand all across the room right now. The words are going to be on the screen. Our worship team's going to lead us. And I just simply want you to follow God's direction. You need to be saved. You come. God's doing something else in your life. Maybe He's calling you to ministry today. You want to surrender to that. Maybe some other decision. Maybe you just need to pray with someone. You come right now as we sing.